I am going to give you a whirlwind talk about factors to consider when ripening avocados. So avocados have some major limitations when we're dealing with them, and it's really sort of along the lines of everything else that we've talked about. But avocados are a global commodity here in the United States and also Europe, which is the other major consumption point, and soon will be in the Far East as China becomes a large avocado consuming nation. And that is time after harvest. It's really, this talk is all about trying to, the bottom line message I want to get to you is that if you're ripening avocados, educate yourself. Absolutely educate yourself. It is absolutely essential that you know and understand the fruit that you're dealing with. And so a key one is the time after harvest. Was that fruit picked 5 days ago or 5 weeks ago? That will influence how you handle that fruit. The stage of ripeness. We're ripening avocados. It's responsible, believed to be responsible in the United States for greatly increasing consumption, but it is difficult to handle ripe fruit like it was difficult to handle pears. Mismanagement at any point in the handling chain can be disaster for further down the road. And then fruit maturity. Avocados, the Hass avocado, which is the variety predominantly of commerce, has a very long harvesting season. In California, you can legally pick it a size 48 fruit in December. We don't really now start our season until February, but you can hang fruit on the very same tree from February to August. The fruit is not an inanimate object on the tree, and so it is changing. So you need, again, to educate yourself about the seasonality of where you're sourcing your fruit. So this is some data that I got from New Zealand, but it's very nice, where they were monitoring the arrival quality. This is when New Zealand was shipping quite a bit of fruit into California, and they sent their researchers to California to monitor the quality arrival of the fruit. And so this graph starts at 22 days, and this y-axis is the percent of the fruit using 5% as a threshold of the percentage of the fruit on arrival that had some kind of problem. So you can see that starting when the fruit's about 4 weeks old, because this is the time after harvest, you start seeing a lot of problems. And that goes along with the literature that you can get about under air storage, about 3 to 4 weeks storage life on avocados before you start seeing symptoms of chilling injury, which I'll show you a picture in a few minutes. So the avocado is a climacteric fruit, and it responds very, very well to ethylene. How fast it responds to ethylene, I will show you more data about this later, depends on what time of the season, how mature the fruit is, the temperature at which you ripen the fruit, and the atmosphere in which you use for ripening the fruit. So, chilling injury. There's two basic forms of chilling injury in the avocado. You have this external chilling injury, which is a scald-like appearance. I'm going to be talking California, what I know about California fruit. Typically, you see this in lower maturity fruit, number one. Number two, you see this if you're storing below 41 degrees or 5 degrees Celsius. You can see symptoms of this within 4 or 5 days of keeping it at a low temperature. You will see more symptoms when the fruit is stored at 1 degree Celsius or 34 degrees Fahrenheit than you would see, let's say, at 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Occurs very quickly. This is internal chilling injury, typically browning, beginning at the base of the seed and moving up the sides of the fruit. You can get vascular discoloration at the same time. This is the chilling injury that takes 3 to 4 weeks typically to occur. Now I can stand here and tell you recipes on how to get this to occur sooner. I'm not going to do that today. But it's modulated by how you handle the fruit. But typically 3 to 4 weeks under air storage, you will start seeing these types of symptoms. And they're usually manifested after the fruit is ripe. Under very severe conditions, you can see graying of the flesh when the fruit is unripe, but typically it's very evident once the fruit is ripe. The fruit is also susceptible to post-harvest decay. We call body rot, which is mainly due to Calototricum or anthracnose, and stem end rot. There's a variety of fungal pathogens that can cause stem end rot. The main one is Bactrosphaeria, or you might know it under the name of Dothiorella. Anthracnose can also cause stem end rot. Okay, typically, again, these are problems of ripe and overripe fruit. In areas where you have very high rainfall and humidity, then you can actually see symptoms of this in the field if the spray program has not been done correctly prior to harvest. I can stand here and tell you that if you mishandle the fruit, you can have 100% decay, and I know that from experiments that I've done in California, where we consider ourselves, we don't have a decay problem. So if you mishandle the fruit, this can skyrocket on you. Every fruit. These pathogens infect the fruit when the fruit are immature and developing in the field. The pathogen sends out like a little germination pore, and then it basically becomes a latent infection. The same thing happens on mango, the same thing happens on papaya, and the same thing happens on banana. These are latent infections waiting for the resistance in the fruit to decline during fruit ripening in order to grow. And the key here then is to get the fruit to ripen before these take over. So maturity, typically around the world, for Hass avocado, people are using 23% dry matter plus or minus. In California, we are at 20.6. My book, way, way too low, but that's what it is. The coloration of the ripe fruit is very dependent upon the maturity of the fruit. And so fruit that are lower dry matter, in the low 20s, will not necessarily color up completely as a fruit that is very high dry matter. So for a typical Hass under California conditions, we start picking in the low 20s. At the end of the season, the fruit can be 34-35% dry matter. Obviously, a lot of things are happening on the tree as the fruit is going from roughly 20-21% dry matter all the way up to 34-35% dry matter. Okay? One of the other things that's occurring is the fruit is actually softening very slowly on the tree. So this is just a picture from a brochure from Mission Produce that actually is talking about this, that the fruit is greener in the early season versus late season when the fruit is ripe. And they can also turn black on the tree under some conditions. So the history of commercial ripening, Jacob Beal was a researcher at UCLA. He was the first one to describe the ripening process of avocados and call it a climacteric fruit. Urvix at UC Riverside actually in 1966 said, hey, if you want to apply ethylene, you can ripen avocados. No one really acted upon that until the early 1980s, and Soo-Kun Lee and Charlie Coggins at UC Riverside actually wrote an article in the California Avocado Society yearbook saying this is how you would do it commercially. It took Henry Avocado and Escondido and Vic Tokar, who's a good friend of both Dennis and myself, to actually, he worked with Henry Avocado and really started the avocado ripe revolution in the early 1980s in California. So why ripen avocados? Well, untreated, you can have one fruit ripe in 3 or 4 days and another fruit, the last fruit not ripe in a carton until 8 or 9, 10 days. And so if you're trying to market this fruit, it becomes a big challenge. So you see all the numbers on that fruit. That is me doing an experiment where we're tracking individual fruit, how long they take to ripen. So applying ethylene increases the uniformity within a carton and decreases what we call checkerboarding. So maturity and days to ripe. So ripening is very dependent upon the maturity of the fruit. Now, yesterday, Barbara talked about propylene, which is a propylene ethylene analog. And so Urvix, again, this is a long time ago. This is Forte avocado. He took Forte avocados when they were physiologically mature, but not horticulturally mature. Remember what Florence talked about this morning. So here, he treated the fruit with propylene and then measured, I'm going to make sure, how many days it took for the fruit to soften. He also measured ethylene production, and he could do that because he applied propylene to the fruit. But anyway, the bottom line is here, 1 to 2% oil. You can't eat that avocado, but it will ripen. And so you can see that the blue line is no propylene, the red line is with propylene. So even when there are only 2 to 3% oil content, you can use an ethylene analog, therefore ethylene, to trigger the ripening of the avocado. So the avocado is physiologically mature long before it is horticulturally mature to eat. This is some data that we collected where we picked fruit from the same trees over the entire harvest season. This is from January to August. And the green bars is no ethylene, and the blue bar is how many days it took the fruit to ripen with a 48-hour treatment of ethylene. Okay, so you can see, except for this time when we had a rain event, there's a general decrease just as the fruit is staying on the tree for ripening, but then in all cases, the ethylene treatment triggered or stimulated the ripening process of the fruit. So this is a graph I made, a table I made for half seasonality based on what I've learned in doing research on avocados. So early season fruit, this is fruit in my idea, less than 25% dry matter. Ethylene treatment would be highly recommended because there's a lot of fruit-to-fruit variability. You get into the mid-season of the fruit, harvest season, this would be roughly 25 to 31% dry matter. The fruit responds very, very well to ethylene. You do get a benefit from treating the fruit with ethylene. And then late season, that fruit wants to ripen, and you just need to keep it at room temperature, and little or no ethylene is actually needed. Maturity also influences all types of things, okay? It influences how the fruit colors. It influences the texture of the fruit. Typically, low maturity fruit can either be bland or grassy in flavor, watery in texture. We know the grassy flavor of the fruit are very high in hexanol, which is a volatile associated with grassy flavor. Immature, low maturity fruit, very high in hexanol. This disappears, and as they develop that nutty flavor, you see an increase in pentanol, which is another aldehyde that's related to nutty flavor. So time after harvest, ethylene has the maximum benefit within 1 or 2 weeks of harvest. If you are dealing with imported fruit, if they've been air shipped, you probably only need 24 hours or less of ethylene. If the fruit's been shipped under controlled atmosphere or have been treated with 1-MCP in some form or fashion, then you're sort of setting the clock back, and they will definitely, potentially, really benefit from an ethylene treatment. So this is time after harvest. So this is no days of storage, 7, 14, and 28 days. This is all air storage, not CA. But this is a 24 and a 48-hour treatment of ethylene at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is the days it took the fruit to get to 1.5 pounds firmness. Okay, so you can see that without any storage, the fruit take much longer to ripen than just 7 days, 14, or 28 days. And what you see is that that ethylene treatment becomes less and less effective, or of greater benefit. Okay, does that make sense? So it's important to know how old your fruit is and how it's been shipped. So within a lot of fruit, though, you can get a lot of variability. So in this graph, This red line is the average days to ripe, so it doesn't matter how many days this is. These first two bars is when we had the fruit within 24 hours of harvest, and we try to ripen them. These last two bars is after 3 weeks of storage at 41 degrees. So what you see is that the difference between this one and this one is the ethylene treatment. And so you can see you don't really reduce the variability from the first fruit to ripen to the last fruit to ripen, but what you do is you greatly reduce the amount of time it took for that fruit to ripen. With 3 weeks of storage, they have the same average days to ripe, but again, you see some improvement in that fruit-to-fruit variability. So if we then take this graph, this is again the same fruit, fruit from the same trees harvested over the season. What you see in general, there is a general decline in the total time to ripe, but also you see that fruit-to-fruit variability decreases as the season progresses, and that the ethylene treatment actually always, except for here at the very end of the season, appears to be of some benefit. Does that make sense? I made this slide when we used to actually pick California House avocados in November and December. We don't do that anymore because we have competition. But typically you would gas the fruit for 36 or 72 hours when the fruit are very low maturity. Mid-season you can see the time declines, and by the time you're at the end of the season, you would only treat the fruit with ethylene for a very short period of time, or just take the fruit into a 20-degree room and ripen it. So management issues. Temperature and temperature is probably the most important thing. And it's very important that they be carefully monitored. You move the fruit when they begin to soften to the point where you are targeting the ripening. And the question is, what is the proper stage of ripeness, and where do you ripen the fruit? So more and more, I know the fruit are being ripened, just like bananas, at destination, and I believe that that is probably the best way to go. So the factors under your control is that you need to educate yourself about differences about the sources of the fruit, because there are differences. You need to do a very good pre-ripening inspection. This means taking firmness readings. And so I mentioned this yesterday at the beginning. Most penetrometers that are sold only go to 22 kilograms, which is roughly 45 pounds. That is inadequate for avocados. Avocados are truly like rocks, and if you have the right penetrometer that can go up to 100 pounds, you will find that the harvest firmness of the fruit can be anywhere from about 50 to 75 pounds firmness. It's absolutely imperative when you're taking an arrival of the avocado that you need to know if the fruit is 60 pounds firmness or truly only 40 pounds firmness. Putting down that it's 22 kilograms plus doesn't tell you anything, because that fruit that's very hard will respond differently and take longer to ripen than the fruit that is truly only 22 kilograms firmness. So that pre-ripening inspection is absolutely critical, and you need to have the right equipment. Ripening management is important, and obviously what you do with the fruit when it comes out of the ripening room is also very important. So the key things for managing avocados is to have uniform heating and cooling. And that is probably the most important tool that you have. And so if you go into Handbook 66, which is available online, you can read how many BTUs this thing produces, and it's roughly 6,000 BTUs per pallet. That's a lot of heat or respiration. Jim Thompson worked out then when he was, when I worked with him on some ripening projects, that you need roughly 1,000 CFM per pallet. You need to try to keep the CO2, this is the broken record, below 1%. And the source of ethylene, physiologically, you only need about 10 parts per million, but in practice, 60 to 100 parts per million, depending on how good your room is, how good you are at moving that ethylene around the room to be exposed to the fruit in the interior of the palate is very important. And I think one of the most important things is that you need to have very good records of what you're doing. So ethylene concentration, physiologically, you don't need very much. I don't see any reason why, if you have a well-designed room, you need to be more than 100 parts per million. You need to know that less mature fruit are going to take a longer treatment. So again, knowing not the arrival dry matter, but the harvest dry matter. You need to work with your suppliers and know what the maturity of the fruit was when it was picked, not when it arrives 3 or 4 weeks from now. Because the dry matter does change during shipping and during ripening. The dry matter actually decreases during fruit ripening, and I have data, I'm not going to show it to you today, that demonstrates that. Time after harvest, again, knowing harvest date, oh my goodness, I'm almost done. 5 minutes? I'll be done. And knowing that is very important. You can see I love avocados. I eat them every day, and I love to work on them and talk about them. So this is just, this was a slide just demonstrating the fact that you don't need more than 10 parts per million. Now, this goes back to when we first started ripening avocados in California, and we used to go around and look at ripening rooms. And at that time, and I've seen this now in Europe, that people are saying, I have a banana room, can I use it to ripen my avocados? So just a point of consideration. This is the rate of respiration of a banana being ripened at 14 degrees C. This is at 18 degrees C, and this is avocados at 20 degrees C. There's a little bit of difference in the rate of respiration. We've talked about this, that not all fruit are created equal. Now, why do you care about the respiration? Because one of the products of respiration is heat, right? So if you do that and you look at it then, you can see then that if you put an avocado in a room that is designed for bananas, you're going to have probably heat spots, because the amount of heat that this thing is producing when it is ripening is far greater than a banana when it is ripening. So you need to make sure that your refrigeration capacity of the ripening room can actually handle the amount of heat that the fruit is going to produce. So cooling is important. I just want to show you this slide. We ripen fruit. So when we would go in and we would take pulp temperatures, especially in the interior of the palate, it was very common to find fruit that were pulp temperaturing at 80 to 90 degrees pulp temperature. And I think Dennis can tell you that a lot of times you could go in, and if your hands were cold, you put your hands in the middle of a box of ripening avocados, you can warm your hands. So we ripen fruit at 68, 77, 86, and 96 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we looked at how long the fruit took to ripen. And like we've talked about in other lectures, when you get to these high temperatures, you're not speeding up ripening, you're retarding ripening. The other thing you're doing is that you're seeing the decay of this ripe fruit skyrocket. And this is with California fruit that have a low decay potential. So the take-home message here is you need to watch your temperature and definitely ripen the fruit below about 70 degrees. Well, how about ripening at lower temperatures? Because they have such a high rate of respiration. This is some early data that was done in New Zealand by Alan Wolf and his research group. And the point here is that when he ripened fruit at 59 degrees, 68 and 77, they saw two things. Not surprisingly, the fruit took longer to ripen when they ripened them at 59 degrees. But the more important thing is the color of the ripe fruit. So we repeated that because I don't ever trust anybody else's research. And we ripened the fruit again at those, we added more temperature. This is work I did with David Oberlin. And what we saw, there is a slight increase in the time to ripe, when you ripen at 59 or 64 degrees, 64 degrees. But we saw just what Alan Wolf reports, is that that fruit is more green when it is ripe, and it is discernible. We did taste panels, and people picked up that green difference. So it was perceptible to the eye. I wanted to cover this. How many have seen pink avocados? Right. So this is hard to track down, but one of the associated factors is you ripen the fruit, partially ripen the fruit, you drop the temperature to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you don't want to bring it all the way down, and then you hold the fruit for like a week. Good way to get pink fruit. Just wanted also then spend 1 second on the outcome of ripe fruit, is that the fruit become very sensitive to bruising and impact damage, which is shown in the bottom picture here. So we have to know how to handle the fruit after the fruit goes through the ripening process. And a study done in Australia showed that 50% of the fruit, internal defects in Australia is due to flesh bruising. Now, we haven't done that study in the United States, but I think that's probably not far off. So the key thing is temperature management is critical. You need to ripen the fruit at the right temperature. Too high, you're going to have more decay, and you're going to actually inhibit. If it's too low, you're going to slow down the ripening and maybe enhance chill and injury. Fruit maturity, more mature, less time. Time after harvest. After storage, less time, but you have to know how the fruit was shipped. Is it under controlled atmosphere? Has it been treated with 1 MCP? You need to avoid delays in marketing, and you need to minimize your fruit handling to protect the fruit from bruising, because it has plenty of opportunity to be bruised at the retail level. So know the history of the fruit, know the quality of the fruit, do a very good pre-inspection. When you get the fruit, standardize the fruit by maturity and size. Make sure that you're uniform and you're warming and cooling, and definitely carefully monitor the fruit. And if you want more information, you can feel free to contact me. The Davis the California Avocado Commission has a nice ripening manual. And if you want to know all things avocados, you can go to this site, avocadosource.com, and it has a lot of really good historical information on post-harvest handling of avocados. Sorry, I went over.
Thank you.